Most passages in the Old Testament that talk about the afterlife indicate that most folks believed that everyone who died went to the same place, the underworld, called Sheol, and there people existed in a marginal-like state in a gloomy environment. There wasn't really a hope for resurrection. According to this general view, there was no escape from Sheol, there was no return from Sheol. Again, all people go to Sheol, and one is even separated from God when in Sheol. In addition to this general view of Sheol, we do find in the Old Testament flickers of hope that develop in particular theological strands. So, for example, we read about passages that indicate God's presence reaching into Sheol. We read about deliverance of sorts from Sheol. And we even read about the defeat of death itself. In a handful of other texts, we find something pretty intriguing. We find actual resurrection being used to explain the restoration of the nation. These three passages are commonly cited when it comes to the pairing of resurrection and the restoration of the nation in the Old Testament. There is some debate among experts on some of these passages concerning the degree to which they are individual or national. In any case, these sort of texts that tie together resurrection and hope for the nation seem to be a foundation from which the hope of individual resurrection arose. The first and only clear reference to individual resurrection in the Old Testament is found in Daniel 12:1-3. So what we find in the Old Testament is that the general idea of the underworld begins to change, driven by a hope that God could overcome death and that God would overcome death for his people. And that idea comes to expression in Daniel chapter 12, and that begins to grow in the Jewish world. Hope for individual resurrection may have grown in the Jewish world, but it didn't grow uniformly. So take 2 Maccabees, for example, this top text. Here the hope is for bodily resurrection. But when one turns to 4 Maccabees, the hope is not for bodily resurrection. The hope is for the soul to continue on after death. There was variation then in the Jewish thought world regarding resurrection. We can detect that in the first century as well. Both Josephus and the New Testament indicate that Pharisees accepted resurrection, but Sadducees rejected it. But it's fair to say that the idea of the resurrection of the dead was held by many Jews by the first century. Now, what's important here for our purposes is that the idea of the resurrection in the Jewish world was that it would take place at the end of the age, the end of the era. And I'll return to that in a later video.